Douglas City Council appears to have a plan to solve housing issues in Douglas. The council recently opened its flagship housing development, the James Brown Apartments, built to the latest environmental standards. So what is Douglas doing that allows it to deliver quality housing projects on time and on budget? And are there lessons to learn for the island's other housing authorities? I'm joined in the studio by two councillors who might be able to answer that.
Hello, my name is Devon Watson. I'm leader of Douglas City Council. I'm with the Manx Labour Party, and we've been working in housing for the past six or 7 years.
I'm Councillor Peter Washington. I'm the chairman of the Douglas City Council Housing and Properties Committee, and I've been working on housing for about 6 years.
So, at the last general election, there was a housing crisis declared. Douglas does appear to be doing something about that. Are you doing enough, would you say?
No, not at all. I mean, so we have built about 100 homes, 100 brand new homes in the past 5 years. Not as much as we want to. I mean, ideally our ambition would be in the 5, 6, 7 times that in order to really sort of make a dent in it. But at the same time, even our low output relative to where we want to be is still 10 times as many homes as the government has built combined, right? And that's mostly because what we do and what we get approved is determined by the state, and there is a distinct lack of ambition by national government in what the housing crisis is and the response to that.
And to be fair on Isle of Man government, what they will say is that they've had a significant programme of refurbishment that they've been undertaking. So, you can't... There are two elements to housing. One is making sure that there are enough houses. The other is making sure the housing is of a reasonable quality.
I think you've got to look at the nuances on this, and the reason that there's a refurbishment programme is historically the inside of the house has been never touched. So we have a huge legacy issue within Douglas Council. At one time, it's not that long since that when people were given the keys to the house, they were putting their own kitchens and bathrooms in. Now they've recognised that they have a duty of care to tenants, and that's not the case. But that's a huge problem for Douglas because we've got the oldest housing stock on the island. We've got properties that are over 100 years old. And so modernising the whole stock has become a big issue, and it's an expensive issue that the tenants are paying for from their rents. And that is not increasing the stock. The population's gone up, but the stock isn't going up.
I mean, I think a big part of the problem with this is that you can also walk and chew gum at the same time, right? Because Douglas Council has been involved in some of the largest refurbishment programs of any housing anywhere on the island. Williston cost a good £40 million. We've continued to do that whilst also building new housing because these are not contradictory goals, right? One of the reasons is you build new houses that gives you additional rental income that allows you to transfer people out of unsuitable homes. You allow people to downsize. And then the economics of it make sense. So a better way of refurbishing homes is also to build additional stock. The government has produced reports over the past 5 years, but the problem with producing reports and analysis is that you can't live inside a report. You can't cook food with analysis. You can't sort of put your kids to bed under sort of recommendations put forward to Tynwald that never actually get actioned. At the end of the day, what people need is actual tangible spades in the ground, and that's the one thing that hasn't been delivered, and that's the one thing that we've really battled to get urgency on.
I mean, people listening to this might think Douglas City Council is completely separate to Isle of Man government. So why is Isle of Man government even in this question? Surely Douglas City Council can just crack on and build what it wants to build.
It's a great question. I mean, if we want to wipe our nose, we need to get approval from government. So essentially, we borrow our own money. We manage our own affairs, we do what we need to do, but in order to take those loans out from HSBC, we need government approval to someone to look over the sums that we've already verified and just say, yeah, okay, this is fine. Ultimately, it doesn't change anything about the projects, but it does add months' worth of delay and additional costs. And it feels like, to a large extent, 1/3 of government is employed to regulate the other third of government and constrain its behaviour and action. And it seems like there's a very strong element of defensive decision-making. we live in a very risk-averse environment where everyone's job seems to be to say, oh, I'm not in trouble for X, Y, and Z. So rather than approving a project that could potentially go wrong, they'd rather delay or slow or frustrate a project just to make sure that at least we aren't in trouble, at least we don't have like another Liverpool landing stage sort of issue.
But there are genuine concerns for Isle of Man government, I suppose, in as much as they act as the guarantor to any of these loans. They need to know that the loans are, for a legitimate purpose, don't they?
I think that's a bit of a red herring when they're saying they guarantee their loans, because it's an old saying, there's nothing as safe as houses and bricks and mortar. Social housing is one of the best investments in money because the rent will always be paid. It doesn't matter what economic cycle we go through. If we're going through a recession, the rents are always paid. If we're going through a boom time, the rents are always paid. There's no risk to the government because at the end of the day, if the council has got lots of houses and we've got loans, the assets that we've got by building those houses still outweigh the loans by far. So it's not a huge risk. And the other thing is, if it ever came to such a situation where they said there's a real deficit or the property, you could sell some of them. So they would always get the money back. It's very much a red herring saying that they're the ones that take the risk. They don't take any risk. In fact, they're making money on this because by forcing us to go to banks, that means that they're getting tax returns on what we borrow. They're getting a double whammy on that. And many years ago, the government used to lend money to local government to build their houses. But then, from what I've been told by some older members who were MHKs, they decided that if we went to the banks at that time, VAT was 15%, they could make more money. Yeah. So it's not about what's best for our population, what's best for the renters, it's what's best for government and their finances.
There is, though, another element that government has to be concerned about, and that is deficiency payments. So, effectively, the difference between the costs to you as a council and the rates. So if the cost is, I don't know, let's say 100, and the rental income is 80. Government pays the other 20 as a deficiency payment, and that is a genuine concern for government.
Yeah, so I think I want to sort of segment this conversation into sort of two sections. One where we talk about Douglas City Council, and the next one we talk about the housing crisis more generally, because we often do that. And if we can focus on that now, and then Peter, being the expert, we can sort of go into the sort of intricacies of the model going forward in the second half of the interview. But during this period here, the deficiency is one of those where I think there's this idea that we can keep the deficiency low by not spending. This is government sort of checkbook accounting logic, but that doesn't really work. What we've actually been able to do is you can reduce down the deficiency by building brand new, efficient, energy efficient apartments that require very low maintenance over the long term. We've got this idea that if we don't spend, therefore our finances will be okay. But in fact, you often need to spend in order to start getting that return on value. What we've seen with our new James Brown apartments, what we've seen with the Peel Road apartments, what we see with the apartments that we're due to build, to put a submission in, that they're going to have much lower lifetime costs. And also they're being built to last 100 years rather than 50 or 60 years. And what that means ultimately is that long-term investment can be paid off for a longer period of time. We're the only local authority that has plans to get off the deficiency, but I think even there, right, is that the government is hyper concerned about the deficiency payments, about £2 million paid to local authorities to subsidise social housing that houses 16% of the population. But at the same time, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions are spent on brownfield development sites, building luxury apartments, purely going to private profit, no social value provided for them whatsoever. And if you would even take a tenth of the money that you put toward a luxury development, then you could build all the social housing that you need. It's just talking about whose interests get served by the current administration.
But those brownfield sites that get that sort of money are generally sites which have been lying empty for many, many years, and the reason they lie empty is primarily because developers can't find a way to make money out of them.
We go to government. There are a number of brownfield sites where we've said, listen, we will build here. We submit plans to say we will build here. We say, can we get access to climate change funds because these properties will have very, very low zero fossil fuels being consumed by them? No, local authorities don't get any access to climate change funds. Can you please get access to brownfield development funds? Sorry, no, only private sector mega rich developers get access to these funds and pots. We could build there. We could build on these brownfield sites. We could build something that is also provides social value, that gives working and middle class people access to spaces in the center of town, gives access to shops and facilities near where they want to be, gives disabled people the ability to live where activity is currently happening, so they aren't kept on the outskirts and the peripheries of the economy. And the answer is just solidly a no every single time.
And I presume that these super energy efficient homes mean that people will be paying significantly less in terms of energy costs, which then means that the impact in relation to either the amount of benefits that people need to get to be able to have a reasonable living, or indeed the amount of spare money they then have to spend in the Manx economy benefits government as well.
A big part of this as well is also when it comes down to the health service, is the fact that what we found is that a lot of people with COPD, with asthma, they move into an energy efficient apartment, they move into a place that is purely fully insulated, that has those air source recovery systems, and they're essentially mold proof to a large extent. And what this ends up meaning is that their health issues are massively alleviated. They no longer need to require the same set of resources from the NHS, and as a result, you end up having these overall national level costs come down. But also, it's not always about costs, it's also the living standards of these people who are human beings who also deserve the basic dignity of being able to live a decent, healthy life. Their lives are improved by that way going forward. But in the same way that the Isle of Man also spends £100 million every year importing fuel, gas, fossil fuels, and reducing down that spend and cost as more money circulating throughout the local economy. Very often, catering to people's basic needs is also good for general economic growth. But I think one of the things I also want to focus on is the people who've been completely excluded from a lot of these conversations is private sector renters. So the Isle of Man has the worst rental rights anywhere in Europe at the moment, while even the Tory government in the UK did 2 tranches of rental rights reform. You can keep a pet there, you get security of tenancy. We don't have that on the Isle of Man. That was promised in 2021. All that would require is changing an internal document with the government, submitting it and getting it regulated, and it hasn't been done because of pressure by folks to prevent any increase in living standards for the people who live here.
I think, though, there was, I think, a legitimate concern from private sector rental people that they were being asked to meet these exacting standards for private sector, but the public sector wasn't expected to meet the same standards.
I think that there's, again, as Peter would say, this is red herring, because we've always said, please regulate us. Put us on the exact same regulations. We'll do it tomorrow. In fact, we'll go over and above. And in the same way that it's also false, right? Because people say Douglas City Council doesn't want to be regulated. No, I'm saying this on the air right now. We always have, we always will. But in the same way that we already are getting regulated by government. The reason why we can't build is because we're highly regulated by government, right? And I understand these concerns, but in the same way that if we were to turn around and regulate public sector properties tomorrow, would the government go in and then decide, okay, private tenants also deserve a bit of support? Because at the moment, we've got people living in absolute slums in sort of places like Mona Street, Christian Road, in the heart of the capital, less than half a mile away from where Tynwald sits. You've got slum accommodation, and yet nothing is being done to help people in these conditions.
Should ratepayers, Douglas ratepayers, I mean, obviously the rest of the island, we're not too worried what you do in Douglas, but should Douglas ratepayers be concerned at what you're talking about? Because it sounds like this is big spending, a big spending approach to sorting housing. Yeah,
I mean, I know this is something that Peter's itching to talk about, the financial model, and I know this is something that I'll let him crack on with a bit later on, but rate money, excellent question. Rate money does not contribute toward housing whatsoever. 80 to 90% of the cost of social housing is paid for by the tenants, and any sort of deficiency is topped up by government grant who pay the deficiency. So our medium-term goal over the next decade is to get that deficiency spending down to zero, to become completely financially independent, have the rents from social housing completely pay its own cost. In fact, we're looking to reduce down the cost of social housing on any taxpayer, but ratepayers don't contribute whatsoever. But at the same time, social housing tenants actually reduce the burden on ratepayers for paying for services. 25% of all of social housing, of all housing within Douglas is social housing. They pay the same rates as everyone else. And in fact, they pay about a quarter, if not more than the rates budget, but they receive less than a quarter of all the total services. In fact, to a large extent, one could make an argument that social housing tenants, to a large extent, subsidize the rest of much of the rest of the island, where a lot of services are concentrated in private sector areas, and public sector areas get slightly less depending on which area you're in.
I'm sure we could debate that for several hours, and local authorities across the island have different views about how rates need to be looked at. Back to the housing then. I mean, if there's a crisis, a housing crisis, and all the successful candidates, I'm almost sure all of the successful candidates at the last election were elected by saying we're going to sort this crisis out. Why do you suppose it's taking government so long to sort this?
It's not just there's a crisis of resources, which I don't think there are. You've got perhaps one of the healthiest sort of financial positions of any sort of major developed Western economy, but the real crisis is there's a poverty of imagination, right? And there's one is they've run out of ideas. So when they say how do we solve the housing crisis, they look at Jersey. Their housing crisis is even worse than ours. Or they say, what has the UK done? What has England done? And England is, for all of the things that England does well, housing is not something that England does well. There are places that have solved the housing crisis, like Vienna in Austria has done a remarkable job. Many places like Japan have done an incredible job. But there is this poverty of imagination in terms of looking at some of these solutions. And there's some decent rental reform. So earlier on this year, there was a motion put forward to Tynwald calling for charging additional rates on dilapidated and long-term vacant empty properties, and that was shot down by 2/3 of the members of Tynwald. All they had to do was say that derelict, dilapidated, or long-term vacancies would now have to pay more in order to incentivize to get those properties back into use, and they say no. Why they say no and substitute that instead for some sort of beautification problem is beyond me, but that would have been the simplest, easiest fix that would have also raised revenue, and they decided not to do it.
I recall, as I was cutting my teeth as an MHK, calling for something remarkably similar and being told that, well, this is all part of a general reform of rates, and you can't just do part of this, you have to do the whole thing all at once to make that work. And yet the previous Treasury Minister did a consultation on tackling small bits of the rating system, particularly in relation to quarries and that sort of thing. So, yeah, interesting that the same sort of reasons are given, and yet we are, we've been talking about this for at least 20 years.
Rate reform and local government reform go hand in hand. And it's such an emotive issue that Tynwald are never going to go there until there's an absolute crisis. And unfortunately, this housing crisis that we've got might be the crisis that forces that issue, because everything is connected in that kind of vein. But at the moment, they are so risk averse of making a decision on anything that they're not going to tackle this, and this is why we're in this situation. This housing crisis is going to get a lot worse.
But I think a big part of this as well is that, you have to ask, it's a crisis for whom, right? Because it's a crisis for young people, it's a crisis for older folks who don't own homes, who are in fact often in a worse situation than many young people without houses. It's a crisis for people who are the struggling middle class, who are battling to keep up with rent payments, and it's struggling for working class folks. And in fact, the housing crisis does impact on everyone, because there is... we used to, back in the 60s and 70s, spend about 10% of our average income on housing. Today, that's up to 36%. Over the next 10 years, maybe between 45-50%. And that just eats the rest of the economy as how higher housing and property costs eventually get passed on to consumers, higher commercial rents, all of that sort of thing. But I think what you also see is that you've got an entire class of decision makers, whether they be politicians, business leader, senior civil servants, who, when they see a housing crisis, all they see is the value of their maybe personal property portfolios go up at the end of the day. They see, okay, the rising value of property, why is that a problem? And the only time that many of them only interact with a young person or a working class person is when they serve them food at a restaurant. I've spoken to MHKs and I've said, listen, housing is a serious issue. And while they make gestures to it on the doorstep, they don't really understand. I mean, when I've spoken about this, Master said, well, housing is more of like a local authority issue. That actually came from a Douglas MHK that I spoke to. Or when you talk to them about this, they are bewildered that, well, people can just get a bit of housing support from government if they are severely poor or have children, which doesn't even cover the cost of a third of rent. There isn't really... Our society is very culturally and socially stratified, so the actual impact of these problems isn't felt by the people who make decisions about these problems.
I think as well, one of the reasons why me and Devon get on so well, we see things differently. He's a lot younger than me, and he's that generation that aren't going to get on the housing ladder. They're going to be permanently in rent, whether it be private or public sector renting. And he hears their stories. He sits and listens to their stories. I'm in my late 60s. I'm a social housing tenant. I sit down in people's front rooms that are in social housing or in private rented of my generation, and what we can compare notes, and it's not just the young people that are being affected, and it's not just the old people that are being affected, it's everybody in the middle as well. There's a big squeeze, and me and Devon, by sitting down and talking about this, we're both members of the Labour Party, and we quite often have discussions and find out it's the same issue. Young people can't get on that housing ladder, and that's putting them at financial risk for later on in their life. And I'm seeing retired people who are already in rented accommodation being penalised, and they're having extra money taken off them from their savings in social housing, and they're never going to be able to recover that. So we see a squeeze all the way through. And when you talk to politicians, they're so far behind times. They're thinking of the situation and the housing crisis is everybody's fault. You don't work hard enough. If you don't work hard enough, you don't get on in life, and that's not the case. And I think this belief in hard work and you'll always be able to afford to buy your own home, which is a cornerstone of liberal capitalist promises, that's no longer available for many residents on the island. And this is why we've got this growing affordability crisis that needs to be addressed. And I think there's too many politicians and civil servants that are making these decisions who are thinking it's the same as what it was 20, 25 years ago when we had building societies. Property was only 3 times what your annual earnings were. And all that has gone.
One of the things that has happened in the last year or so is Clause 5, the controversial Clause 5 in the Local Government Amendment Bill, unified local authorities, almost anyway. I don't think all the local authorities came on board, but almost all the local authorities came on board in terms of their opposition to that Clause 5. They seemed at that stage all to be keen to work together and to develop collective solutions to the overall problems. If MHKs are saying housing is a local government problem, why doesn't local government all get together and try and solve this problem?
I mean, that would be great. I mean, what that would require to a large extent is that the approval authority is, I mean, in the best possible world, right? You'd rather have that policy and strategy and regulation be coordinated nationally and maybe delivered locally, right? Like you would see that direct local communities would have a say into their housing projects, but direct targets and that would be set nationally rather than local communities begging government to do something. Because currently what we've seen within government and within DIY, a lot of the people who do work in DIY, by the way, and work in these various housing departments are absolutely incredible. I've met really talented, I've been really fantastic people, but they're hamstrung by their structures. Their talents need to be unlocked. And what happens is what we've seen is just reorganization and shuffling deck chairs and moving things around within government over the past several years while they prepare to do something. And I think the idea is that if we just wait long enough, maybe the problem will sort of solve itself. And yeah, local authorities should probably get together and do something. I mean, we've been already work really closely with many local authorities in housing, but that national strategy does have to be coordinated nationally, because ultimately Douglas can only build in Douglas.
And yet,
I think as well, the local authorities, we have the municipal association, and that's a cornerstone of how the local authorities all get together and discuss these things. There's no disputing that both me and Devon are both attend those municipal meetings from representing Douglas Council. So when you're pointing out, this clause 5, it's the fact that what really bound everybody together is it was another example where government wasn't listening to anybody else except their own little echo chamber. And that's one of the biggest problems that we've got. They don't see that local government can solve anything. They treat local government like it's you're never going to be able to do any of this. We're the big boys. We make all the decisions, and we're not even going to involve you. You're just there as a token representation, and that to us is what drove the municipal association to get together and mount such a project. And I think what that showed is that, the municipal association has got teeth. And if there are other instances when government start treating with contempt local government like they did that time, they've got to be very careful, because we've proved that we can band together and we can make a decision and we can change and influence.
But what you have described is government dragging its feet on rate reform, government dragging its feet on local government reform, central government I'm talking about, dragging its feet on housing. If local government got together and could speak with a united voice and come up with solutions to all of this, why does local government have to wait for central government to do things unto it? Why doesn't local government try and get a grip of some of these agendas and kind of offer solutions, so that all central government has to do is say, yeah, that's a good idea, we'll do that? Because
ultimately the decisions is you need 10, 15 people you need two or three people to sort of initiate a plan and sort of get it going, right? But there are 50 to 20 people who are able to shut the program and say no. And ultimately, because also local authorities, to a large extent, the deficiency part is one large thing. And in order to sort of push a general, coherent, large housing plan, is that it would have to require resources coming from one or the other. But the thing is, though, even if we were to submit proposals to central government, they would just say no. For example, on waste strategy, we wanted to get a meeting with the local central government. We've been trying for 3 months. DY won't meet with us. We try and get a meeting regarding flood defences. They won't even meet with us in a room. And in order to get the approval to get a project started, get it done, even borrow money, even spend money on maintenance, we want to spend more money on maintaining our properties, and government says no, because they set hard limits. You can only spend 33 or 34 or 35% of your total income on maintenance spending. They want to be in charge. And ultimately, that doesn't come with any reciprocal responsibility.
Maybe you need to talk to them a bit nicer, because Ramsey has had 2 attempts from DOI to give it flood defences, and
they won't even meet us in the room. Yeah. They won't even have a conversation with us. In fact, these decisions are made without the input of the political members whatsoever. Because when I inform the political members on what the decision from the DOI has been, they're shocked, right? And very often it's the case of who actually runs our state is very often the case that very often it's not the politicians. They get presented with an option, they get presented with like 1 or 2 options, and they have to pick between option A and option B, and they aren't consulted in the construction of either one of these 2 options. And this is a problem more generally within government, is that our elected representatives aren't sort of riding the tiger, so to speak. They aren't in control of the state.
Well, that's quite a shocking thing to suggest, because surely to goodness, certainly most of the MHKs will be fighting and trying to defend their seats at the next election. And I'm sure they would say, actually, hang on, we are in control. We are driving forward our departments. I mean, if they honestly think that they're not, then perhaps they're in the wrong job.
Well, maybe this is just from my perspective from the outside, but if MHKs are in charge of their departments, then they have to be accountable for the failures of their departments. But the problem is that we've seen particular departments that have long-term systemic structural failures, and you get rid of one minister, replace it with another minister, you replace it with another minister, you get more ministers than you have years every so often, and yet the decision making is identical. You can have two different ministers who have completely different, diametrically opposed personalities and political opinions, and yet one gets removed, and yet the way the department operates is identical. And what that indicates is that maybe the ministers in question have much less influence over the outcomes than one would think, because there's an entire machinery of state behind this. And this isn't a criticism of any individual minister, it's a criticism of the way that our state operates.
You've got to, if we look at the housing crisis and local government which provide the housing, it's not just local government that seems to be struggling with this. If you look at the health service, they're struggling. If you look at education, they're struggling. So there's a pattern emerging here of are the politicians making the decisions, or are the civil servants making the decisions? And what me and Devon are trying to emphasise is that every time we try to move forward, we're walking through 6 inches of mud being dragged back every time, because there's somebody spraying water on the ground that we're walking on to stop us getting any further forward.
So maybe you need to stop being perhaps so direct in terms of the questioning that you give to departments, and maybe try a more subtle approach. Maybe offer take them out for a bit of cake and a cup of coffee, and try and charm them a bit, rather than say, actually, I think government's failing here, there, and everywhere, and maybe the charm offensive would be more successful.
I mean, that would be absolutely ideal. I mean, for 5 years, since coming into post, since when I was chair of housing, and since becoming leader, all we've done is try and massage the egos of government and say, hey, listen, we really like what they're doing here. We really support the DOI. We really support Treasury. We really support Tenworld. We really love Coleman. Like, they're doing an amazing job. We're trying to implement their policies. We're trying to reduce down costs on them. We want to give them additional help and support. We've been providing resources. We provide resources to the police free of charge. We provide resources to the homelessness teams at a far reduced rate. We provide a huge number of resources to central government without asking for anything in return. And we've tried this really conciliatory approach where we try and work with them, and we give them everything that they want. But the problem with this is that it's yielded us not only nothing, but it's actually reduced the amount of support that we get, and it's reduced the amount that they're willing to listen to us, because at the end of the day, that they only really respond to whoever sort of shouts loudest. And this is not really an appeal to the existing MHKs in Tynwald, because they aren't going to deliver us anything for us. The reason why I'm saying this now is the hope that the next administration that comes in, hopefully that they take this problem seriously and they actually do something for the first time. Because it's all good and well to sort of set up a board or a committee or set up a structure or set up this, that, or the next, but you actually have to start delivering. And this is, you can sort of write off this current administration. Maybe the next administration will be better, and I'm more than happy to sort of work with them in regardless of whatever capacity I'm in.
I think we have tried the charm offensive. When we opened the James Brown apartments, we invited all the MHKs round to see what it is we're doing, what the standard is, and the benefits of building good quality homes. It's not just a benefit for the tenants; it's a benefit for the health service. It's a benefit for the if there's children living there in the education system, and all these benefits. And we asked all the MHKs, we invited them all around to come and see this. Now, a lot of MHKs did, especially the ones in Douglas, and some that it did have an impact on. But I was quite shocked at the amount of MHKs that didn't come, and that is very sad, because that's a flagship. We've got a housing crisis. Douglas Council have got a 10-year plan and an answer to resolve this housing crisis, and we've got a big example, and a lot of them didn't turn up, and the DOI minister didn't turn up, which was, to me, is quite shocking.
I mean, obviously, the DOI minister has lots of things that he has to do. So presumably, if one of his members was there, then that would be sufficient, would it?
And not in my book, no, because it's such a big issue, is the housing crisis, and it's his department that has got social housing in his brief, as to say, that should be on the top of one of his agendas. He shouldn't be listening to other people telling him what's going on. He should be coming and having a look.
So, getting back then to the housing that you are working on, and this plan that the leading councillor Devon was telling us about, that you would somehow get to a position where you wouldn't need deficiency payment. I mean, how does that work?
The issue that we've got with Douglas City Council housing is we don't set the rents. The government set the rents. So when they set the rents, if they're not setting them at an economically viable level, we are going to have a deficiency. So if there's any deficiency on housing, it is all down to the government by not setting the rent. Social housing tenants, there's a belief from people that aren't in social housing that we're on some kind of benefit and we're second-class citizens, and it's our own fault that we can't afford to buy our own properties. Social housing tenants don't see that. Social housing, we're paying for a service. And that's how it should be. Social housing has been going for well over 100 years, and it's in a bigger crisis now than it's ever been for over that 100 years. Social housing started out after the First World War. That's when there was a big boom in building social housing. At a time when there was no money, they still built social housing because people needed that housing and the rents paid for it. The next biggest increase in social housing was after the Second World War, when there was no money, because it pays for itself. So I think in this crisis that we've got now is we've got people living in absolute dire situations, and we need to build more social housing. Our population's growing. The influx of new people, they all need somewhere to live. And the squeeze on the private sector is too much. But one of the main issues that I'm raising, and especially in council, and the councillors are backing me on this, is this 5-year fixed-term tenancy, which to the tenants is absolutely appalling. In the UK, they don't have fixed-term tenancies. That's been outlawed. They've got to have a rolling tenancy, but yet here on the Isle of Man, it's 5 years, and you've got to go through this review, and it's not a pretty exercise to go through.
So why was that introduced then?
You'd have to ask the government, but from me, as chairman of the housing in Douglas, I have no idea who is running this programme. This new housing board that they've got, I don't know who's running it. They've never been in touch with me. They've never come to me to say, this is our plans, this is what we're doing. All my officers tell me is, this is the law, this is what we have to do. And that seems to be a disconnect now between Douglas Council, who actually own the housing, and the government that seems to be setting the tenancies and the rents. If Douglas Council own the properties, we are the landlord. When our tenants come to us complaining that they are struggling, whether it would be with maintenance or with financing, it's the councillors that are sitting listening to the problems. It's not the people in government that are listening to some of these issues. And it's becoming a more... This is a snowball that's rolling down the hill, getting bigger and bigger because more people are being put on this 5-year fixed-term tenancy. It's having a real adverse effect on retired people, because lots of people who have been in social housing for 30, 40, 50 years, because of their careers, whatever it is, their decision why they could never be able to afford a private house. And some of them, it might be religious, not wanting to take a loan out. It might be the fact that they're socialist and they don't believe in going to banks and borrowing money. There's lots of different reasons. We've got people that have had cancer, they can't get insurance to get a mortgage. There's lots of different reasons, but we shouldn't be saying to these people that just because you can't afford to buy your own house, you rent from the council or you rent from government. What seems to be happening is because they own the properties, they think they own the people, and this is now where we're getting a backlash. Elderly people have took out extra pensions to be able to make sure that if the state pension didn't fund their rent, they would always be able to afford the rent. But now with this, the more you earn, the more you pay. we're getting tenants that have been in rented accommodation in social housing for 30, 40 years. And now the rent has gone up by 40 and 50%. It's disproportionate for the government to bring in a scheme that's penalising people that have been paying in for years on the belief that some government official somewhere thinks we've got millionaires living in social housing. It just isn't true.
So what you have said earlier in this last exchange, I suppose, is that the way to solve the deficiency payment is to get rid of or to increase rents. So how much do you think the rents would have to go up to sort this? And would that then put them on a par with private sector rents?
I don't think it'd put it on a par with private sector rents, because private sector rents, it's a completely different model, because what they're doing is they've got to make a profit. And what social housing, it isn't necessarily to make a profit, it's to be able to maintain the properties and going forward with that. And I think in the past, the government have falsely kept it down, thinking they're doing people a service, and that's not what's happening, because they're just storing up. Because if we don't have enough rent in, we can't do the maintenance. If we can't do the maintenance, that's why people are living in damp properties. And then that builds up to now where we've got this legacy crisis that a lot of our rent is being paid to maintain issues and problems and properties. It should have been done years ago. If they'd have done it years ago, we wouldn't be in this situation. The refurbishment at Williston is a prime example of that. That's a 40 million project that should never have happened, because if those houses had been maintained, they wouldn't be in the situation that they were. The government made the council install that cavity wall insulation, and everybody up at Williston knows exactly what's gone on there. And that has been the cause of the root problem of all the damp up in Williston. So people have been making decisions, forcing it onto the council housing department, that really they weren't qualified and they shouldn't have been making. Now, these are the legacy issues that we've got. Now, it is important to think about if we do get rid of the deficit, are the rents going to go up? But at the moment, because people that are working above those levels that are set now, they're paying more rent, and the elderly who've got private pensions, they're paying more rent. So in effect, the rents are already going up, but they're only going up for the people that are in the existing. What it does mean is then, the way that tenants are seeing that now is, if everybody that's working is paying a higher rent, all they're doing then is subsidising people who are on housing benefit, because the government don't want to put the rent up, because they don't want to increase housing benefit. 20% of people in social housing are on housing benefit, and I think sometimes when the government are looking at, do we put the rent up, the first thing they do is look at that 20%, how much is it going to cost us, and say, oh, we're not doing it. That's my belief.
I mean, in terms then of the housing programme, I mean, what do you have on your housing programme? Because I know we've discussed earlier how difficult it is to get all the things on the wish list onto the actual government approved. We're able to crack on with this side. But what is the next big project for Douglas?
It's a really exciting thing, and unfortunately, timing is probably out by just a few weeks or a month or two. But there is some exciting developments coming along that we want to do, and I think we've proved with the Peel Road flats that we've built and with the James Brown apartments that we've built, we're building more or less on time and on budget, and that's something that, that the government, when you start talking about some of their projects have gone wrong, when it comes to housing, we've got a proven track record in Douglas City Council that, we can more or less get there on time and on budget. We can't always account for inflation, but that's the world that we live in. And we've got some more exciting projects that are coming. We've had a 10-year plan for well over 5 years. And there's a lot of the things that we want to do is in that 10-year plan, and that's on our website. And that's been given to the government. And what really surprised us is when we've asked some of the political members about our 10-year plan, they didn't know that it existed, because when we send it to the DOI, it just stops there. And they're just saying, we can't afford it. But it's not their money. It's not their money. It's the rent payers who are paying for this.
Is Douglas perfect?
Is Douglas perfect? That is a really good question. It really is, and I don't want to give an off the cuff answer to something that is quite deep. I don't think we're perfect, but I think the direction that we're going in is that's where we aim to be. We don't always get everything right, but I think the moral compass that we've got from the councillors that we have in there at the moment is based more on what is the right thing to do, not how much is it going to cost. And I think that's the biggest difference that we met between our local government here in the city of Douglas and probably some central government departments.
Okay, well, almost at the end of the programme now, but if you were the DOI minister, and DOI minister, for those who don't know, is the minister most responsible for housing. There are several ministers who have a bit of responsibility. Treasury Minister, obviously, as we've discussed, has some responsibility for housing, particularly in relation to funding, and then there are other areas of government that have bits of responsibility. There's also the Housing Board. But if you were in a position, I guess as the housing minister, the DOI minister, what would be the things, if you had a list of 3 things that you wanted to do to radically improve the way in which housing is delivered in the island, what would they be?
First thing to do is, with Peter Washington speaking, I would say they need to give back the social housing that they've got back to the local authorities, sell it back to them. That's, that could be quite an easy thing to do. If they give back the houses that they've got to the local authorities, then when local people are renting them, when they've got problems, they go to their local representatives, and then their local representatives can sort out their local problems. What central government needs to do is they need to become the regulator. They need to be the ones that sets housing rental standards, and also they should have some kind of arbitration service where they intervene between people's rights and landlords' wishes. And I think the biggest thing that we can do is we need to separate them. You cannot be a gamekeeper and a poacher, and that's what they're trying to do. And it's going to get muddled and confused. And from my point of view, is central government should be the one that looks at legislation, sets out fair legislation, and it's got to be primary legislation, not secondary legislation, which keeps shoving housing through, because that's why we're ending up in the mess where we are. It has to be primary legislation where it is discussed by everybody in Tynwald, and everybody can have a proper discussion about it, put amendments to it. At the moment, things seem to be going through on a nod in secondary legislation, and that's where I feel that we're in this crisis because of that. So I think if government took on the role of policing social housing, and I think what they should be doing is, in the future, our housing stock and our housing demographics of renting and buying are completely changing. And there's only 64% at the last census were actually owner occupiers. You got 16% who were in public rented and 18% in private rented. We've just had another census, and I suspect that's going to completely change, and we're going to be more or less 50-50 between house owners and renters. When we get to that point, those people in rented need protection. They need to have their own ombudsman that they can go to, and we need to have rent control. There's no two ways about it. Rent control has got to come in, and because I think secure, affordable housing for all citizens is going to have to be a fundamental right. We cannot have this. People can just rent and then a landlord can say, well, out you go. And to a certain degree, this 5-year fixed-term tenancy, no matter how they dress it up, that's very much the kind of situation is that they think, oh, well, you've got too much money, you're out. Who's deciding who's too much money? Because it's certainly not the council.
You've heard there from Douglas councillors Devon Watson and Peter Washington, so what do you think? Seeing is believing, and what we see in Douglas is a housing agency getting on with the job of building quality houses. Can Isle of Man government learn from Douglas? Do the clunky internal procedures of government need an overhaul? Anyone out there up for delivering change? Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gorn at manxradio.com and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast. I'm Phil Gorn. Go to myusongage.com. Thanks for listening.